New York City, in the 1920s, was a city of contrasts. The skyline gleamed with towering structures, and the streets echoed with the chatter of a million dreams. But beneath the glitz and glamour, an empire of a different kind ruled. It wasn't visible in the newspapers or on the front pages. It wasn't a government, but something far more clandestine, a secret government of crime that controlled the veins of New York, its very heartbeat. The power of the five families was a force that few could challenge, let alone understand. They were not just criminals, they were a law unto themselves. Their empire was built not on public offices, but in shadows, in dark corners where the average citizen was too afraid to even glance. The city, with its hum of activity and constant motion, hid within its depths the quiet whispers of a society that bent to the will of five criminal families. These families, though largely unknown to the outside world, controlled industries, manipulated politics, and ruled over neighborhoods with a chilling, invisible hand. They were a silent government, far more powerful than any politicians who walked the streets in daylight. They were the true movers and shakers. Their influence was felt in the deepest alleyways and in the finest boardrooms. This was a world built on loyalty, betrayal, and bloodshed. Yet, even in the darkest corners of New York, it was the mafia that painted the true portrait of power, and they did so from behind the scenes. The five families were not just a part of New York's criminal underworld, they were the very fabric of the city's underbelly. The Gambino, Lucchese, Genovese, Bonanno, and Colombo families were at the center of it all, their names spoken in hushed tones, their reach long and lethal. These families had no need for flashy displays of power. Their empire thrived in secrecy. In the smoky backrooms of restaurants, the dark alleyways where the city's fortunes were made, the five families orchestrated a quiet, sinister ballet. It all began with a series of events that would forever alter the course of American history. The rise of the five families was rooted in the same soil that bore the immigrants who arrived at Ellis Island, looking for a new beginning. But instead of jobs on factory floors or streets paved with opportunity, many of these immigrants found themselves drawn into a world of crime, corruption, and survival. With prohibition in the early 20th century, the demand for illegal alcohol turned ordinary men into criminals, and criminals into kings. Bootlegging became the lifeblood of New York's underworld, and it was the mafia families that capitalized on this opportunity. The tension of that time, a time of struggle and lawlessness, became the perfect breeding ground for a criminal empire like no other. The five families were born from this chaos. Men like Charles, Lucky, Luciano, Salvatore Maranzano, and Joe Masuria began to forge a network of influence, one that would stretch its tendrils into every corner of New York. Their rise was not swift, but rather the result of years of maneuvering, alliances, and violent power struggles. Behind the flash of gunfire and the quiet whispers of betrayal, the groundwork for a new empire was being laid, and its foundations were made from blood. Each family was like a kingdom, and at its head sat a king, the Don. The Don was not just a boss, he was a symbol of power, the embodiment of control. To become a Don was not just to rule a family, but to control a vast empire of illegal activity that spanned the city. Yet, it was not an easy road to the top. Each Don had to climb over a mountain of corpses, betray alliances, and outwit his rivals. The mafia was not a place for weak men. It was a world where power was everything, and the price for that power was often death. What truly set the five families apart from any other criminal syndicate in the world was their structure. They were not a loose group of thugs, they were a well-oiled machine, a sophisticated network of crime that stretched from the streets of New York to the farthest reaches of the globe. At the heart of it all was the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of each family. This commission was responsible for maintaining peace between the families, ensuring that their interests were protected, and that the flow of money continued uninterrupted. It was this organizational brilliance that allowed the five families to thrive while others faltered. But for all their power, for all the wealth they amassed, the five families were always under threat. From the outside, the government and law enforcement were slowly closing in. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, led by agents like J. Edgar Hoover, had the mafia in their sights. But the families were not easily intimidated. Their power was built on a foundation of secrecy and fear. The government could not touch them, not as long as they held the key to the city's underworld. And yet, within the families, there was a growing sense of paranoia. Betrayal was an ever-present shadow in the mafia world. No one could be trusted for long. Family members turned on each other, friends became enemies, and loyalties were bought and sold in the blink of an eye. The darker side of this world began to emerge as the families, once united by shared interests, began to fracture. Ambitions grew larger. Power struggles were inevitable. Men who had once been allies found themselves on opposite sides, each vying for supremacy. The streets became a battleground, and no one was safe, not even within their own family. It was the dawn of a new age, and the rules of the game had begun to shift. The old methods, the ones that had worked for decades, were no longer as effective. The government had its sights set on the mafia. Meanwhile, the families were engaged in a bitter war for control of the most lucrative criminal operations. As they fought for dominance, the entire structure of the mafia seemed to be teetering on the brink of collapse. Yet, even as the empire seemed to crack at its seams, the legend of the five families lived on. It was no longer just about the men who ran the families. It was about the myth that had grown around them. The idea that these men were untouchable, invincible, was more powerful than the reality of their empire. And it was this myth that would ultimately be their downfall. The five families were not just a part of New York's history, they were its shadow. Their fingerprints were on everything from labor unions to Hollywood, from the docks to the highest offices in the land. Their influence was everywhere, and yet, they remained unseen. To most people, they were just stories, whispered rumors. But to those who had seen the truth, the men who had lived through it, there was no escaping the fact that the families had shaped the very city in which they lived. Their legacy, for better or for worse, would never be erased. As the years passed, the power of the five families began to fade. Law enforcement, once helpless in the face of such a vast empire, had begun to close in. The families were no longer invincible. Betrayals ran deep, and once formidable bosses were brought to their knees. The golden age of the mafia was coming to an end. But even as their power waned, the legend endured. The stories of the five families were retold, each one more captivating than the last. These men, these families, would live on in the minds of the public, forever etched into the fabric of New York's history. And so, as the city of New York continued to evolve, the ghosts of the five families remained, fading memories of a time when crime ruled the streets and the mafia was king. Their reign, though over, had left an indelible mark on the city, a mark that would never be forgotten. The story of the five families is not just a story of crime and power. It is a story of how a hidden empire once controlled the heart of New York, and how it ultimately fell, leaving only whispers in the wind, the echoes of a time when crime was not just a business, but a way of life. The streets of New York in the early 20th century were a battleground of survival, a city teeming with the energy of immigrants chasing dreams of a better life. But alongside the dreams, there was a darker reality, one that was not so easily seen. For every immigrant who sought refuge in the bustling metropolis, there were others who saw opportunity in its shadows, opportunity in a world where laws were bent, bribed, and broken. The birth of the five families came not from a desire to build an empire, but from the necessity to survive in a world where survival itself was a game of power, control, and influence. In the early 1900s, New York was a city of immigrants, with waves of Italians, Jews, and Irish arriving at Ellis Island, hoping to escape the poverty of their homelands. But for many, the promise of prosperity quickly faded as they found themselves fighting for scraps in the city's grim underbelly. In neighborhoods like Little Italy, the harshness of life bred a different kind of ambition, a drive not just for success, but for survival. It was here, amid the tenements and crowded streets, that the seeds of the mafia began to take root. The earliest form of organized crime in New York was not nearly as polished as the powerhouses that would rise in the following decades. At first, it was a collection of street gangs, small-time criminals, and petty thieves who sought to control the city's neighborhoods. They extorted local businesses, ran illegal gambling operations, and dealt in whatever illicit goods they could get their hands on. Yet, as the years passed and the city grew, so did the sophistication of these gangs. What had once been small, localized operations started to merge into something larger, something more organized, something more dangerous. In the wake of Prohibition, the mafia's role in New York's underworld changed forever. When the 18th Amendment banned the sale of alcohol in 1920, it created an explosion of opportunity for organized crime. The demand for illegal alcohol was massive, and the streets of New York became flooded with bootleggers who saw the potential for vast fortunes. The Five Families, at the time a loose group of Italian-American families, were ready to take full advantage of this new business. The rise of the mafia was not accidental. It was driven by men who understood the importance of control. Salvatore Maranzano, who would go on to become the head of one of the most powerful families, was one of the first to recognize that the fragmented world of crime could be unified into a single, more powerful force. He began to gather power by consolidating smaller operations under his leadership, and his influence spread quickly, like roots branching beneath the surface. Maranzano, born in Sicily, was an outsider in New York's criminal world, yet his ambition knew no bounds. He didn't just want to run a gang, he wanted to control the entire criminal underworld. But he was not the only one with such grand ambitions. Joseph, Joe the Boss, Masuria, another powerful figure, ruled the streets with a heavy hand. Masuria, who also hailed from Sicily, was the head of the most influential crime family in New York at the time, the Masuria family. He was a man of violence, with a reputation for ruthlessness that made him feared and respected across the city. Masuria and Maranzano soon became rivals, each vying for control of the city's illegal alcohol trade. Their competition was not just for money, but for power, the kind of power that could reshape the city itself. In the early years of their rivalry, the conflict between Masuria and Maranzano was violent, but it was also tactical. These men weren't just fighting in the streets, they were waging a war for the very structure of organized crime. Their conflict escalated, and soon, the mafia's presence in New York would be defined not by an undercurrent of fear, but by open warfare between these two titans. What followed was a battle for control of the city, a battle that would go down in history as one of the defining moments in mafia lore. As the war between Masuria and Maranzano grew more brutal, a new player emerged, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano was born in Sicily, but he had arrived in New York as a child, and he had learned quickly how to navigate the brutal world of organized crime. Unlike Masuria and Maranzano, Luciano wasn't interested in the old-world ways of doing business. He was a modern man, a visionary who understood that in order for the mafia to truly thrive, it needed to evolve. He saw the disarray caused by the war between Masuria and Maranzano as an opportunity to bring about change, a change that would redefine the mafia forever. Luciano's vision was simple: unite the fractured mafia families into a single, organized system. Instead of endless infighting, Luciano proposed a commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the families, that would make decisions for the mafia as a whole. This commission would ensure that no single family could dominate all others. Luciano was clever, and his rise to power was strategic. He knew that in order to bring the families together, he would have to take down the two men who stood in his way, Masuria and Maranzano. The turning point in this war came in 1931. Luciano, who had initially worked under Masuria, made a decision that would change the course of history. With the blessing of Maranzano, Luciano betrayed Masuria, orchestrating his murder in a shocking move that sent shockwaves through the criminal world. Masuria's death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Luciano had eliminated the old guard and paved the way for his own rise. But he didn't stop there. With Masuria out of the picture, Luciano turned on Maranzano, having him killed as well. In one fell swoop, Luciano had removed two of the most powerful men in New York, securing his place at the top. The death of Masuria and Maranzano marked the birth of the modern mafia. Luciano's victory wasn't just a personal triumph, it was the foundation of a new era. With the two old rivals out of the picture, Luciano moved quickly to cement his control. He established the Commission, which was made up of the heads of the 5 most powerful families in New York, the Gambino, Lucchese, Genovese, Bonanno, and Colombo families. These families, under Luciano's leadership, would go on to dominate New York's underworld for decades. Luciano's genius lay not just in his ruthlessness, but in his ability to see the bigger picture. He understood that in order for the mafia to thrive, it needed to operate like a business. The Commission was not just a tool for control, it was a way to keep the peace among the families and ensure that everyone got a piece of the pie. With the Commission in place, the 5 families would grow richer and more powerful than ever before. Luciano's leadership marked the beginning of the golden age of the mafia, a time when the 5 families ruled the streets of New York with an iron fist, their empire extending far beyond the city itself. But the story of the 5 families was not one of uninterrupted triumph. The families, as powerful as they were, would face countless challenges in the coming years. Betrayals, turf wars, and rivalries would continue to plague them. Yet, despite these struggles, the legacy of the 5 families was cemented during this period. The foundations of their empire were laid not just in the streets of New York, but in the minds of the people. The mafia had become a symbol of power, of an alternate world that operated beneath the surface of society. It was a world where loyalty was everything, and betrayal could cost you your life. And as the 5 families grew stronger, they would come to embody the very spirit of New York, rough, resilient, and relentless. In the years that followed, the 5 families would expand their reach, not just in New York, but across the country. The mafia's influence stretched from the docks of Manhattan to the casinos of Las Vegas, from the backrooms of union halls to the highest offices in the land. The families controlled not just crime, but entire industries. They were the unseen rulers of the city, their influence felt in every corner of New York life. The story of the 5 families, once a tale of survival and ambition, had become a legend that would be passed down for generations. And in the shadows of New York's bright lights, the families continued to thrive, their grip on the city's soul stronger than ever before. The power of the 5 families in New York wasn't just in their control over the streets or their ability to dominate illicit trades. The true source of their strength lay in the hands of the men who led them, the Dons. These men, often larger-than-life figures, held the fate of entire families in their palms. Their names would become synonymous with power, fear, and influence. Salvatore Maranzano, Charles Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, and Tommy Lucchese. Each of these men played a pivotal role in shaping the fate of New York's underworld, and their actions would leave lasting scars on the city. Their journeys to power were as varied as the neighborhoods they hailed from, but each one was marked by ambition, cunning, and a relentless pursuit of dominance. Salvatore Maranzano's rise to power was nothing short of a spectacle. Born in Sicily, he arrived in New York in the early 1900s with a vision of organizing the chaos that was Italian-American organized crime. In the face of a fractured mafia, Maranzano sought to impose a new order, bringing the disparate gangs together under his rule. He wasn't just looking to control the streets, he sought to establish a dynasty. His vision was not only for wealth, but for prestige and control over all criminal enterprises. To achieve this, he needed to be the supreme authority. He didn't see the fragmented world of mafia operations as a business to run but as a kingdom to rule. However, Maranzano's rigid, old-world thinking would become his undoing. His authority wasn't accepted by all, especially not by the younger, more dynamic members of the mafia who saw him as stuck in the past. His downfall, at the hands of Luciano and his followers, was inevitable. Maranzano's reign was marked by a brutal insistence on tradition, but it was also his downfall. While his dream of a unified mafia would become reality, it was at the cost of his own life. On the other side of this power struggle stood Charles Lucky Luciano, a man who would go on to be one of the most iconic and influential figures in mafia history. Luciano was a visionary, someone who understood that the traditional methods of mafia rule were outdated. While Maranzano's rigid approach stifled growth, Luciano's approach was dynamic, practical, and, above all, modern. Unlike Maranzano, Luciano didn't just want to control the mafia, he wanted to reform it. Luciano was born in Sicily, like many of his peers, but he grew up in New York City, which allowed him to see the broader picture. He recognized that the mafia's strength lay not in rigid hierarchies, but in structure and cooperation. Luciano introduced the idea of the Commission, a council of mafia families that would work together to avoid conflicts and maintain peace. This was revolutionary. It allowed for a more balanced distribution of power, preventing one family from becoming too dominant. His leadership wasn't about creating a dictatorship, it was about creating a system of order in an inherently chaotic world. Luciano's rise was swift and brutal. His decision to betray Masuria, his former mentor, was a turning point in mafia history. The murder of Joe Masuria in 1931 was a calculated move that effectively eliminated the old guard of the mafia. Maranzano, having ascended to the top position after Masuria's death, didn't realize that his own days were numbered. Luciano, seeing the opportunity to solidify his power, orchestrated the assassination of Maranzano. With Maranzano out of the picture, Luciano was able to assume control, marking the birth of the modern mafia as we know it. But Luciano's ability to unite the mafia didn't come without its own challenges. Even as he created a more structured system of crime, power struggles continued. The balance he sought to maintain was always on the edge of tipping over, as the other bosses began to maneuver for their own control. One of these men was Vito Genovese, a figure whose own ambition and cunning would shape the direction of the Genovese family, which would eventually become one of the most powerful families within the Commission. Genovese, like Luciano, was born in Sicily, and his rise to power was equally as ruthless. Genovese's journey was marked by betrayal, violence, and, above all, ambition. He initially worked under Lucky Luciano but soon grew disillusioned with Luciano's leadership. Genovese believed that Luciano's more democratic approach to mafia leadership, while successful, was a sign of weakness. Genovese, ever the opportunist, saw himself as the true heir to Luciano's throne, and he wasn't afraid to use violence to claim it. His attempt to take over the leadership of the Luciano family led to his eventual exile, and it took years before he could return to the United States and reclaim his position of power. Genovese's return to power marked the beginning of a new chapter for the mafia. Under his leadership, the Genovese family grew into one of the most formidable forces within the Commission. He was a master manipulator, capable of convincing people to do his bidding, and his violent streak made him both feared and respected. Genovese's reign was marked by an expansion of the family's influence, but his rule was also plagued by paranoia. Like many of the mafia's leaders, Genovese became obsessed with the idea that he was constantly under threat. His desire to control everything and everyone around him would eventually lead to his downfall, as it did for many of his contemporaries. Meanwhile, there was Joe Bonanno, another ambitious figure whose name would be forever intertwined with the history of the mafia. Bonanno, born in Sicily, arrived in New York at a young age. He was a skilled operator, and his rise through the ranks of the mafia was marked by intelligence and diplomacy. Unlike the more brutish methods of other mafia leaders, Bonanno relied on subtlety and strategy. His approach was less about violence and more about cultivating relationships and alliances. He was a master of negotiation, and he quickly gained a reputation for being able to broker peace between rival families. However, Bonanno's diplomatic skills did not shield him from the inevitable conflict that came with such power. Over time, he would clash with other dons, particularly with the more aggressive and ruthless figures like Vito Genovese. His attempts to maintain peace within the Commission would ultimately be his downfall, as the balance of power began to shift. Finally, there was Tommy Lucchese, a figure whose role in the five families was often overshadowed by the more infamous names. Lucchese was a quiet operator, preferring to keep a low profile and avoid the limelight. But despite his reserved nature, Lucchese was a formidable force within the mafia. His family, the Lucchese family, would become one of the most influential families in New York's criminal world. Lucchese was a pragmatic man, always thinking strategically and weighing his options carefully. He knew that in the cutthroat world of the mafia, survival meant adapting to the changing tides. Lucchese's family would go on to control a significant portion of the city's most profitable criminal enterprises, including labor racketeering, extortion, and, in later years, drug trafficking. His ability to stay out of the public eye while amassing vast wealth and power made him an intriguing figure, and it was a testament to his skill as a leader. These 5 men, Maranzano, Luciano, Genovese, Bonanno, and Lucchese, were the architects of the mafia as we know it today. Their leadership and vision shaped the 5 families and ensured their place in the annals of criminal history. Each man brought his own unique skills and qualities to the table, but all shared a relentless desire for power and control. Their stories are intertwined, marked by betrayals, power struggles, and a constant battle to maintain dominance in a world that was as dangerous as it was lucrative. As the leaders of the 5 families, these men didn't just rule their families, they ruled a city. New York, for all its charm and grandeur, was their kingdom, and they ruled it with an iron fist. Yet, despite their power, none of them could escape the forces that would eventually bring the mafia to its knees. Their legacy, marked by bloodshed, loyalty, and ambition, would be felt for generations to come, shaping the course of organized crime in America for decades. In the early days of the mafia's rise to power, there was a quiet war raging in the streets of New York, a war fought not just with guns and knives, but with cunning, strategy, and the manipulation of opportunity. And nowhere was this conflict more intense than during the Prohibition era of the 1920s. When the U.S. government enacted the 18th Amendment, banning the production and sale of alcoholic beverages, it inadvertently created a perfect storm for organized crime. Alcohol was now illegal, but the demand for it had not disappeared. This void opened the door to one of the most profitable criminal operations in history, bootlegging. The 5 families, with their ruthless ambition and unrelenting drive, seized this moment to expand their power, setting the stage for an era of unprecedented growth and violence. The streets of New York during Prohibition were chaotic, alive with the hum of bootleggers moving liquor from hidden distilleries to speakeasies and private clubs. Behind closed doors, entire networks of criminals, many of them linked to the 5 families, were running massive operations that supplied the city with alcohol. What was once the domain of small-time crooks and petty thieves was now an empire, a sprawling underground network that controlled the flow of booze, and with it, the flow of money. The families were no longer just street-level operators, they had become kings of an underground economy, and they ruled with impunity. For men like Salvatore Maranzano and Lucky Luciano, Prohibition represented the golden ticket. It was a chance to build something far greater than what had been possible under the old, disorganized system of crime. The demand for alcohol was massive, and it required a level of organization that could not be sustained by mere street gangs. Luciano, ever the visionary, understood that in order to profit from Prohibition, the mafia would need to function like a well-oiled machine. The traditional ways of doing business, through intimidation, theft, and casual violence, were not going to be enough to sustain long-term success. What was required was structure, cooperation, and discipline. This was the moment when Luciano began to think beyond his family, envisioning a more centralized and powerful mafia that could dominate not just the streets, but the city itself. Luciano's vision took shape as he began consolidating power within the mafia. The fractured world of organized crime, rife with small factions and constant infighting, was ripe for a leader like him. The bootlegging business provided the leverage Luciano needed to assert control. He was a brilliant strategist, not just a mobster. He saw the potential of the commission, a governing body that would unify the heads of the 5 largest families, ensuring peace and prosperity among them. This move was revolutionary. No longer would the families operate in isolation or engage in pointless turf wars. Instead, they would come together, sharing the profits and ensuring that their combined influence would be felt across the entire city. As the families grew in power, so too did the violence that accompanied their rise. The Prohibition era was not without its bloody moments. The competition for control of the alcohol trade led to turf wars, betrayals, and assassinations. Rival families were constantly clashing over territory, seeking to carve out their own share of the market. In many ways, Prohibition was the mafia's proving ground. It was a time when the strongest survived, and the weak were crushed beneath the weight of ambition and violence. Luciano, however, was no stranger to this ruthless world. His rise had been paved with the bodies of his enemies, and he was willing to go to any length to ensure his place at the top. The violence that erupted during Prohibition was not confined to street-level thugs and low-ranking soldiers. The dons themselves were involved in the brutal game of politics that often spilled over into bloodshed. Luciano, in his bid for supremacy, began systematically removing his rivals. The most notable of these was Joe Masuria, who had once been Luciano's mentor. Masuria, like many of the old-school bosses, believed in traditional mafia practices. He ruled with an iron fist, but his outdated methods were no match for Luciano's vision of a more organized, less chaotic criminal empire. Masuria's stubborn refusal to adapt to the changing times ultimately led to his downfall. In 1931, Luciano orchestrated Masuria's murder, an act that not only eliminated a key rival but also solidified his control over the future of the mafia. With Masuria out of the picture, the path was clear for Luciano to take control. But his victory did not come without consequences. The power vacuum left by Masuria's death invited further conflict, particularly with Salvatore Maranzano, who had once been Masuria's rival. Maranzano had initially been a supporter of Luciano, but as Luciano's influence grew, Maranzano began to see him as a threat. The two men had vastly different visions for the future of the mafia, and their clash was inevitable. In a move that would change the course of mafia history, Luciano had Maranzano killed, securing his own position at the top of the heap. These murders, brutal and calculated as they were the beginning of a new era for the five families. Luciano, now firmly in control, was able to bring the families together under the structure of the commission. But the commission was not just a tool for maintaining peace, it was a symbol of Luciano's genius. Through the commission, he was able to create a system of governance that transcended individual families. The commission was made up of the heads of the five families, Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Lucchese, and Colombo, and was responsible for resolving disputes, overseeing business dealings, and ensuring that the mafia operated smoothly. The creation of the commission allowed the five families to grow even more powerful. With their operations unified, the families were able to expand beyond New York, moving into new territories and markets. The wealth generated by the bootlegging trade was staggering, and it attracted the attention of law enforcement, who began to target the mafia with increasing frequency. But despite the efforts of the authorities, the families seemed to be untouchable. They had become too entrenched in the fabric of New York society. Their influence reached deep into the city's political and economic systems, and their criminal activities were protected by a web of corruption that was almost impossible to untangle. The mafia's reach went beyond just bootlegging. As Prohibition came to an end in 1933 with the repeal of the 18th Amendment, the families quickly adapted, finding new sources of income. With the end of alcohol prohibition, the mafia turned its focus to new criminal enterprises, many of which had been operating in the shadows during the dry years. Gambling, extortion, labor racketeering, and loan sharking became the new sources of revenue. But perhaps the most profitable venture for the five families during this period was the labor unions. Mafia bosses infiltrated labor unions across the country, particularly in the construction and longshoreman industries, and used them as a front for racketeering. Under the direction of the families, the unions became an indispensable part of their empire. They controlled the workers, and in doing so, they controlled the construction of entire buildings, bridges, and highways. The city's infrastructure was at the mercy of the mafia, and no project could move forward without their approval. The labor unions provided a steady stream of income, while also serving as a shield for the families. With the unions under their control, the mafia was able to launder money, manipulate wages, and ensure that their power remained unquestioned. But while the families were growing wealthier and more powerful, the undercurrents of tension within the organization were becoming harder to ignore. Rivalries, once pushed aside for the sake of unity, began to resurface. The families were becoming increasingly fragmented, with each family seeking to expand its own empire at the expense of the others. The Commission, which had once served as a unifying force, was now struggling to keep the peace. And as the families became more entrenched in their power, they began to attract the attention of law enforcement and rival criminals who were eager to challenge their dominance. The golden age of the mafia, brought about by the windfall of prohibition, was not without its cracks. Despite the wealth and power amassed, the families were always under threat, both from within and without. The underworld was a constant battleground, a world where nothing was certain and everyone was expendable. As the families navigated this dangerous world, they had to be ever watchful, constantly shifting alliances, eliminating rivals, and adapting to new challenges. Prohibition, though a boon for the mafia, would prove to be only the beginning of an even greater struggle for control and survival in a city where the stakes were always high, and the consequences of failure were often fatal. In the years following the Prohibition era, the mafia's dominance in New York's criminal world grew even more pronounced, but so too did the complications that came with it. The vast fortunes generated during the Prohibition boom had cemented the five families' place in the city's underworld, yet the increasing complexity of their operations created a precarious balance. The mafia no longer relied solely on bootlegging, they had branched out into a multitude of profitable avenues: gambling, extortion, labor racketeering, and even drug trafficking. But with success came new challenges: the need to maintain control, manage internal disputes, avoid law enforcement, and, perhaps most dangerously, protect themselves from rival criminals who were eager to take their place. As the years moved on, the mafia would continue to thrive, but it would be forced to confront new realities that would stretch its power to its breaking point. One of the greatest sources of income for the five families came from gambling. The allure of casinos, numbers rackets, and high-stakes card games was irresistible to many, and the mafia quickly monopolized this sector. From the smoky backrooms of local businesses to the glitzy, neon-lit casinos in Atlantic City, the mafia's grip on gambling operations stretched far and wide. In New York City, the mafia ran an extensive illegal gambling operation, including the infamous numbers racket, a form of illegal lottery where individuals bet on three-digit numbers in the hopes of striking it rich. These numbers games became a ubiquitous part of daily life for many New Yorkers, particularly in the city's lower-income neighborhoods, where legal gambling options were scarce. The system was well-organized and highly profitable, generating millions of dollars annually, and it was protected with the same ferocity as any other mafia-run business. The families had their hands in everything, and as they extended their reach, they ensured that no one could compete with them without paying the price. Another significant source of income came from labor racketeering. As the mafia's influence in the city grew, they infiltrated labor unions across various industries, particularly those related to construction and the docks. The longshoremen's unions, which controlled the hiring of workers at the busy New York piers, became a critical point of control for the mafia. Through threats, intimidation, and violence, the families manipulated union elections, ensuring that their candidates would win and that they would continue to control the flow of labor. With control over the unions, the mafia could dictate who worked, how much they were paid, and under what conditions. These unions were not just a source of income but also a means to control the city's infrastructure, as nearly every major construction project had to go through the unions. Building skyscrapers, bridges, and roads required the mafia's approval, making them indispensable to the city's growth. In return for their influence, the unions gave the mafia a cut of the profits, and this arrangement continued to fuel the family's power. But while these businesses made the families immensely wealthy, they also introduced a degree of risk. Law enforcement was beginning to pay more attention to the mafia's operations, and they had to become more sophisticated in their efforts to avoid detection. The federal government, particularly the FBI, began to zero in on the mafia's vast network, and investigations into the family's operations became increasingly frequent. Yet the mafia's influence over New York's politicians, law enforcement, and even the press gave them a shield of protection. Many city officials were in their pockets, either through bribery or outright threats, and this allowed them to continue operating with relative impunity. Still, the growing law enforcement scrutiny meant that the families had to be more careful in their dealings, less obvious in their violence, and more adept at covering their tracks. As the mafia's wealth and power grew, so too did the number of enemies they made along the way. The rise of the mafia led to a parallel rise in competition. Rival criminals, eager to stake their own claim to the city's lucrative underground market, began to challenge the five families. At first, these rivals were smaller, fragmented groups that operated outside the control of the established families, but over time, they began to grow in power. In particular, the so-called rogue factions within the mafia started to gain influence. These groups were made up of disillusioned soldiers and underbosses from the five families, many of whom felt that the current leadership wasn't sharing enough of the wealth or power. These upstart factions, driven by ambition and greed, were a constant threat to the established order, and the old rule of family first began to fray. These groups fought tooth and nail for territory, leading to an era of internal strife and bloody gang wars. One such war was the infamous Castellammarese War, a conflict that would forever change the structure of the mafia in New York. The war was waged between two rival factions, the forces of Joe Masuria, the reigning boss of the most powerful family at the time, and Salvatore Maranzano, a rising star within the mafia. Masuria, a Sicilian immigrant who had been at the top for many years, represented the old guard of the mafia, while Maranzano, a younger, more ambitious leader, wanted to restructure the mafia and establish a more organized system. The fight between them was not just for control of New York's criminal enterprises, but for the future of the mafia itself. The war was marked by a series of bloody confrontations, betrayals, and shifting allegiances as men on both sides maneuvered for power. In the end, it was Luciano's betrayal of Masuria that sealed the fate of the old guard. Masuria's death in 1931, orchestrated by Luciano and his allies, marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. With Masuria gone, Luciano and his allies, including Maranzano, consolidated power and reshaped the structure of the mafia. Maranzano, though, did not last long. His vision for a more traditional, hierarchical mafia clashed with Luciano's desire for a more modern, collaborative approach. Luciano, now firmly in control, had Maranzano killed, further cementing his dominance over the New York mafia. This period of bloody internal warfare and shifting power dynamics was crucial in the creation of the Commission, the governing body that would oversee the five families and ensure peace among them. This restructuring allowed Luciano to introduce a more unified, efficient form of mafia rule, one that would help the five families thrive even as their operations grew more complex. Yet despite Luciano's attempts to bring order to the mafia, the specter of violence and betrayal was never far behind. The mafia's criminal empire was built on a foundation of fear and loyalty, but loyalty was often a fleeting thing in the underworld. As the families became more powerful, so did the personal ambitions of those within them. Rivalries among the dons, as well as between underlings vying for promotion, continued to fuel tensions. No one was ever truly safe in the mafia. Even the most trusted men could find themselves betrayed in a heartbeat. And when it came to loyalty, it was often tested under the harshest conditions. The families may have been unified under the Commission, but their peace was always fragile, held together by a tenuous thread of mutual interest. The rising tensions between the five families and the increasing competition from rogue factions brought about new challenges, not just from rival criminals, but from law enforcement. The 1930s and 1940s saw a concerted effort by the FBI and other agencies to root out organized crime, but the mafia's stranglehold on New York remained strong. They had cultivated relationships with politicians, police officers, and judges, making it difficult to effectively bring them down. As the families grew in power, so did their ability to evade the law. The feds, though determined, were often frustrated in their attempts to catch the mafia at its most profitable and ruthless. The families were experts at keeping their operations in the shadows, often using legitimate businesses as fronts for their illicit activities. They were adept at laundering money, hiding their wealth, and operating without detection. They had become untouchable, at least for a time. But this would not last forever. As time went on, the mafia's grip on New York began to loosen. The rise of new technologies, the expansion of the federal government's reach, and increased efforts by law enforcement to infiltrate the mafia all contributed to its eventual downfall. But before the families would fall, they would continue to thrive, even as the world around them changed. The mafia's operations would grow even more sophisticated, branching into new criminal ventures, but as they reached the peak of their power, the pressure from both within and outside their ranks would mount, creating an inevitable tension that would eventually unravel their empire. The era of the five families, defined by ambition, wealth, and violence, was reaching its zenith, but it was also beginning to show the cracks that would lead to their eventual decline. The landscape of New York was changing in the mid-20th century, and with it, the mafia's grip on the city was beginning to show signs of strain. By the time the 1950s rolled in, the five families were no longer the uncontested rulers of the underworld. They had expanded into new territories, extended their reach across the United States, and accumulated wealth beyond imagination, but they were now facing more challenges than ever before. The old methods of doing business, built on fear, loyalty, and secrecy, were starting to fray at the edges. The world was evolving, and so too was the nature of crime. The once seemingly impenetrable mafia was now becoming vulnerable in ways it hadn't been before. A significant catalyst for this change was the rise of law enforcement. The post-World War II era marked the beginning of a more concerted, focused effort to combat organized crime. The federal government, under the direction of the FBI, launched an all-out assault on the mafia, aiming to dismantle their power structure. The mafia had operated for decades in a world of corruption, where local law enforcement was either complicit or too corrupt to act. But by the 1950s, the balance of power was shifting. The FBI, under the leadership of men like J. Edgar Hoover, had begun to prioritize the mafia as one of the nation's most pressing criminal threats. For the first time, they began to treat organized crime as a coordinated, national threat rather than just a localized nuisance. The mafia had always been adept at evading the law, but the FBI's growing resources and new investigative techniques made it harder to stay hidden. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants became crucial tools for the government. These methods allowed authorities to infiltrate the mafia's operations in a way they had never been able to before. The old days of bribing officials to turn a blind eye were no longer as effective, and the families were beginning to feel the pressure. The men who had once been untouchable were now being pursued relentlessly, their every move under scrutiny. One of the most dangerous tools the FBI used against the mafia was the RICO Act, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970. The RICO Act was a game-changer. For the first time, the government could target the entire structure of organized crime, not just the individual criminals. This law allowed authorities to charge mafia bosses and their associates with a pattern of criminal activity, even if they had never personally committed a crime. This was a direct assault on the mafia's hierarchical structure, which had always depended on the idea that the top bosses were insulated from direct criminal involvement. Under RICO, even the dons could no longer escape justice. Yet the mafia didn't collapse overnight. Despite these challenges, the five families remained entrenched in New York's underworld. In fact, some of their most iconic and influential figures emerged in the 1950s and 1960s. The power and wealth of the families continued to grow, albeit under a growing sense of paranoia and suspicion. The dons, once able to move freely and operate with confidence, now had to be cautious. They surrounded themselves with bodyguards, took measures to avoid surveillance, and lived in constant fear of betrayal. They knew that loyalty, once their strongest asset, was beginning to waver. It wasn't just the law enforcement that they had to worry about anymore, it was the growing instability within their own ranks. One of the key figures during this period was Vito Genovese, head of the Genovese family, who had been involved in mafia politics for decades. Genovese was a master manipulator, known for his ability to outmaneuver rivals and maintain control even in the face of adversity. His family was one of the most powerful in New York, and under his leadership, it expanded its influence into a wide range of illegal enterprises, including drug trafficking. However, Genovese's paranoia and ruthless ambition eventually led to his downfall. In the 1950s, he attempted to take over the commission itself, challenging the established order of the five families. His move was seen as an act of betrayal by the other dons, and the resulting fallout led to his downfall. Genovese's fate was a warning to the others in the mafia. The internal power struggles that had always existed within the families were becoming more vicious, and loyalty was becoming harder to maintain. The rise of informants, or rats as they were called in the underworld, was another key factor in the changing landscape of mafia power. For generations, the mafia had operated under a strict code of silence, known as omerta, which forbade members from cooperating with the authorities. This code of silence had been one of the mafia's greatest strengths, as it ensured that even if the police caught a member, they would be unable to provide any useful information. However, by the 1960s and 1970s, the code of silence began to break down. The intense pressure from law enforcement, coupled with the increasing number of arrests, led many mafia members to turn state's witness in exchange for lighter sentences. One of the most famous turncoats of this era was Joe Valachi, a member of the Genovese family, who became the first mafia member to testify before Congress in 1963. His testimony exposed the inner workings of the mafia in a way that had never been seen before, giving the public, and law enforcement, an unprecedented look at the organization's structure. Valachi's decision to cooperate with the government was seen as a betrayal of the highest order. For years, the mafia had prided itself on the loyalty and silence of its members, but Valachi's revelations shattered that illusion. His testimony revealed not just the mechanics of the mafia, but also the extent of its corruption and violence. It was the beginning of a wave of informants who would go on to expose the mafia's operations, both in New York and across the country. The more members turned informant, the more the government was able to chip away at the mafia's power. The once untouchable bosses were now facing the prospect of their own associates betraying them. The 1970s were a turning point for the five families. While they remained powerful, their control was increasingly fractured. The era of absolute power held by the dons was coming to an end, and with it, the mafia's ability to operate with the same ruthlessness and efficiency. The public's perception of the mafia began to shift as well. Once seen as a shadowy, powerful force, the mafia was now regarded with growing disdain. The families, once feared, were becoming a symbol of decay and corruption, their influence waning as the government cracked down harder. One of the most significant events that symbolized the changing tides was the Gotti era. John Gotti, the notorious head of the Gambino family, rose to prominence in the 1980s. Gotti, known for his brash personality and flashy lifestyle, represented the new wave of mafia leadership. Unlike the old-school dons, who operated quietly behind the scenes, Gotti reveled in the public eye. He was the epitome of the Teflon Don, a name he earned after multiple acquittals in high-profile cases. His ability to avoid conviction despite overwhelming evidence was seen as a testament to his power and influence, but it also highlighted a shift in the mafia's operations. Gotti's rise to power was a moment of triumph for the Gambino family, but it also exposed the vulnerabilities of the mafia. His brashness, his willingness to flaunt his power, and his constant battles with law enforcement symbolized a new, more public face of organized crime. Yet, it was precisely this behavior that led to his eventual downfall. His public persona made him a target, and in the end, he was convicted and imprisoned, marking the beginning of the end for the once mighty Gambino family. By the late 1980s and 1990s, the mafia's influence in New York had waned considerably. The five families, while still powerful, were no longer the untouchable empire they once were. Internal divisions, law enforcement crackdowns, and the erosion of loyalty had chipped away at their power. They were no longer the feared kings of New York, but rather a symbol of the past. Their once impenetrable networks were now riddled with informants, and the men who had once sat at the top of the criminal hierarchy were either behind bars or living in constant fear of betrayal. The mafia had evolved over the years, but so had the methods used to bring it down. The families had played their part in shaping the city's underworld, but the world they had built was crumbling, piece by piece, as the forces of law and order closed in around them. The era of the five families, once marked by unbridled power and dominance, was now slipping into history, and a new chapter in New York's criminal legacy was waiting to be written. By the early 1990s, the once unassailable power of the five families in New York was beginning to unravel. For decades, they had ruled with a brutal efficiency, their power rooted in a complex web of corruption, intimidation, and violence. The families were embedded in every facet of the city's life, from the docks and construction sites to the casinos and nightclubs. But the world had changed. The streets that once echoed with the hum of organized crime were now flooded with the bright lights of modernity. Law enforcement had become far more sophisticated, and the mafia's secretive world was beginning to crumble under the weight of its own excesses. The very methods that had allowed the mafia to flourish for so long, loyalty, silence, and violence, were now working against it. In the era of rapid information flow, new technologies, and growing public awareness, the mafia was facing a crisis of relevance. And in this new age of the mafia, power struggles within the families were becoming more frequent, as younger, more ambitious men sought to capitalize on the fading empire their predecessors had built. At the heart of the changes that were happening in the 1990s was the rise of federal law enforcement. The mafia's ability to operate in the shadows was slipping away as law enforcement, particularly the FBI, sharpened its focus on organized crime. The use of wiretaps, surveillance, and sophisticated investigative techniques like undercover agents had made it far easier for authorities to infiltrate mafia operations. No longer were the mafia's crimes confined to physical violence and the occasional corrupt cop. The federal government had successfully expanded its efforts, using the powerful RICO Act to target not just the low-level foot soldiers but also the mafia bosses themselves. These new legal tools allowed the government to strike at the very heart of the mafia structure, and the repercussions were devastating. The days when dons could live comfortably in their penthouses, surrounded by wealth and power, were over. New York was no longer the fiefdom of the mafia, its grip on the city was slipping, and with each passing year, their operations became more exposed. One of the key events in this new chapter was the trial and conviction of John Gotti, one of the most notorious mafia bosses in American history. Gotti, the head of the Gambino family, had earned the title of the Teflon Don for his ability to avoid conviction despite numerous attempts by the government to bring him down. His brazen defiance of the law made him a celebrity in his own right, and for a time, he was untouchable. His ability to evade justice was a symbol of the mafia's invincibility. However, Gotti's bravado and public image would ultimately prove to be his downfall. In 1992, Gotti was convicted of murder and racketeering after his underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, turned state's witness. Gravano's decision to testify against Gotti marked a pivotal moment in the downfall of the mafia. Gravano, one of the most feared and respected members of the Gambino family, had long been loyal to Gotti. But as Gotti's power and public profile grew, Gravano became disillusioned with the flashy, attention-grabbing lifestyle that Gotti embraced. He saw it as reckless and self-destructive. When it became clear that Gotti was going to be convicted for a series of murders, Gravano made the fateful decision to testify against him. His testimony was damning, exposing the inner workings of the Gambino family and implicating Gotti in numerous crimes. The trial and conviction of Gotti, once thought to be invincible, marked the beginning of the end for the Gambino family's dominance. It was also a major blow to the overall reputation of the mafia, as it signaled that even the most powerful bosses could fall when loyalty broke down. But while the conviction of Gotti sent shockwaves through the underworld, it was not the final blow to the mafia's power. The five families, though wounded, were still a force to be reckoned with, and they continued to operate, albeit more cautiously. The 1990s saw a shift in how the mafia conducted its business. No longer were the dons sitting at the top of their families, making decisions from behind closed doors. The younger generation, raised in a time when the mafia's dominance was fading, began to take control. These men, many of whom were second or third generation mafia members, were less concerned with upholding the old traditions of the organization and more focused on profit and survival. They were also more susceptible to the pressures of law enforcement and the increasing influence of modern technology, which made it harder for them to keep their operations hidden. As a result, the mafia in New York began to fragment into smaller, more autonomous factions, each with its own goals and operations. During this period, many of the old mafia bosses passed away, either from natural causes or from violent ends. The rise of younger, more ambitious leaders led to infighting and disorganization within the families. These younger bosses, many of whom had spent their lives in the shadows, were now in positions of power. But they lacked the cohesion and unity that had once defined the five families. Their leadership was often marked by infighting, distrust, and a constant battle for dominance. The more seasoned dons, such as Paul Castellano and others, had understood the importance of loyalty and cooperation within the family. But these younger bosses were more interested in personal gain, often putting their own ambitions ahead of the family's unity. This internal power struggle would eventually lead to further fragmentation and weaken the mafia's power. The families, which had once been united in their shared goals and mutual interests, now became a battlefield for competing factions. Infighting between the younger bosses led to the dissolution of alliances, and rivalries between families began to heat up. In a few cases, these rivalries led to murders and other violent acts that further destabilized the mafia's grip on power. The families were no longer operating as a cohesive unit but as fragmented, self-interested factions vying for a larger piece of the shrinking pie. The government, meanwhile, continued its relentless pursuit of organized crime. The FBI's focus on infiltrating the mafia's ranks intensified. Agents went undercover, infiltrating the families and gathering intelligence that would later be used to prosecute mafia members. The constant threat of being exposed, arrested, or betrayed by an informant made it increasingly difficult for the families to function with the same efficiency they once had. The pressure on the families was relentless, and as their operations were brought into the light, their ability to maintain control of New York's criminal activities began to diminish. In addition to law enforcement's increased vigilance, the social and economic landscape was also shifting. The rise of the Internet, digital communication, and the globalization of business created new opportunities for crime, but also new risks. The mafia, once a powerful force rooted in the streets of New York, struggled to adapt to a rapidly changing world. Their traditional methods, coercion, violence, and secrecy, no longer seemed as effective in the face of new technology and the globalized nature of crime. The city itself was changing as well. In the late 20th century, New York underwent a transformation. Once the epicenter of organized crime, the city was cleaned up, gentrified, and revitalized. The old neighborhoods, once dominated by the mafia, were now becoming upscale, with new businesses and higher rents pushing the mafia out. By the 2000s, the influence of the five families was a shadow of what it once was. Their criminal activities, though still substantial, had been severely curtailed. The families had been fragmented, their operations scattered and reduced. Many of their old-school ways of doing business were no longer viable. Younger members of the mafia were arrested, turned informant, or forced into hiding, and the old guards who had once controlled the streets were either dead or imprisoned. The five families, once a symbol of New York's criminal power, were now a relic of the past. However, even as the mafia's grip on New York loosened, it did not disappear completely. The five families still operated in the shadows, albeit at a much smaller scale, maintaining remnants of their old power. But the world they once dominated had changed beyond recognition. The mafia, once a symbol of invincibility, was now just one chapter in the long and turbulent history of organized crime in New York. The rise and fall of the five families was a testament to the fleeting nature of power. For decades, they had ruled the streets, but as time marched on, their empire began to crumble, victims of their own hubris, internal divisions, and the relentless march of law enforcement and societal change. By the time the 1990s arrived, the mafia in New York had entered a new phase, one marked by an uneasy balance between survival and decay. The five families, once powerful and untouchable, were now facing a relentless barrage from both the authorities and rival factions. Law enforcement had intensified its efforts, launching covert operations and employing increasingly sophisticated surveillance methods to bring down the mafia's leadership. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, had set its sights firmly on organized crime, and with the passing of the RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, Act, the mafia's foundation was shaken to its core. RICO allowed law enforcement to charge entire criminal enterprises as a whole, not just individuals, making it possible for the authorities to target the upper echelons of the mafia leadership, the dons themselves. The once invincible bosses, who had once been above reproach, were now in the crosshairs of an expanding, highly motivated government. At the same time, the world was changing in ways that the mafia, long rooted in tradition and secrecy, was struggling to keep up with. The economy was evolving. Technology was rapidly advancing. The internet and cell phones, tools that made life easier for millions, also made it easier for law enforcement to track and infiltrate criminal networks. While the mafia had once thrived in the shadows, its ability to operate in secrecy was being compromised. The FBI's success in gathering intelligence through wiretaps, informants, and covert surveillance brought a wave of anxiety to the underworld. The days when mafia bosses could sit comfortably in their lavish offices, orchestrating their empires with a sense of security, were long gone. The families, while still powerful, were now navigating a world where their every move was being scrutinized, and their every word was a potential lead for law enforcement. One of the most glaring examples of the changing dynamics of the mafia came in the form of John Gotti, the notorious head of the Gambino family, whose rise to prominence and subsequent downfall epitomized the volatility and transformation of organized crime in this era. Gotti had been the very definition of the Teflon Don, a mafia boss seemingly invulnerable to prosecution. With his cocky attitude, media presence, and ability to outmaneuver law enforcement, he became the face of mafia power in the late 1980s. His fame was built not just on his violent exploits, but on his remarkable ability to avoid conviction in multiple high-profile cases. For a time, it seemed as though Gotti was impervious to the law, a modern-day kingpin who played the system like a master chess player. But the very things that made Gotti a legend in the underworld, his showmanship, his defiance, and his love for the public spotlight, ultimately contributed to his undoing. His arrogance became his weakness. As the FBI and other law enforcement agencies closed in on him, Gotti's actions became increasingly reckless. He continued to make brazen public appearances, flaunting his power and influence, drawing attention to himself at a time when discretion was critical for mafia leaders. While his ego and defiance fueled his rise, they would also prove to be the catalyst for his eventual fall. His downfall began with the testimony of his trusted underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gravano, who had been one of Gotti's most loyal lieutenants, made the decision to turn state's witness in exchange for a lighter sentence after being arrested for multiple murders. Gravano's decision to testify against Gotti was a seismic event in the world of organized crime. For decades, the mafia had operated under the strict code of silence, omerta. This code dictated that members of the mafia would never cooperate with law enforcement, no matter the circumstances. Yet, Gravano's betrayal shattered this code, marking a shift in the loyalty and trust that had defined the mafia's operations. When Gravano took the stand in 1992, he painted a detailed picture of Gotti's criminal activities, implicating him in several murders, racketeering, and other illicit operations. With his testimony, Gravano dealt a devastating blow to Gotti's defense. It was a moment that highlighted how far the mafia had fallen, from a secretive, tightly knit organization to a criminal enterprise riddled with betrayal and internal divisions. Gravano's testimony was the nail in the coffin for Gotti. Despite his previous ability to evade conviction, the weight of the evidence and Gravano's testimony proved too much for him to overcome. In 1992, Gotti was convicted on charges of murder, racketeering, and a litany of other crimes. His conviction marked the end of an era for the Gambino family and symbolized the shifting tides of power in New York's underworld. Gotti's imprisonment did not just signify the fall of a kingpin, but the crumbling of an entire era of mafia dominance. It was the final reminder that the mafia, despite all its wealth and influence, was not invincible. The authorities were getting smarter, and their ability to infiltrate and dismantle organized crime syndicates was improving. With Gotti's fall from power, the Gambino family was left in disarray. His arrest and conviction left a void at the top of the family, a leadership vacuum that exposed the cracks within the mafia structure. The organization, once unified under the figure of a powerful Don, began to fracture. The infighting that had been simmering for years now erupted into open conflict, with various factions within the family vying for control. Without Gotti's strong leadership and charisma, the Gambino family found itself in a struggle for survival, trying to maintain its influence while dealing with the pressures of a changing criminal landscape and increasing law enforcement attention. While the Gambino family was reeling from Gotti's fall, the other families were also facing their own crises. The Genovese family, long considered the most powerful of the five families, was dealing with its own internal struggles. Vito Genovese, the family's notorious boss, had died in 1969, but his legacy of manipulation, ruthlessness, and power had left a lasting imprint on the family. In the years after his death, the family found itself embroiled in a series of leadership battles and conflicts with rival factions. The Genovese family, known for its secrecy and discipline, was not immune to the changes sweeping through the mafia. While it maintained a significant presence, particularly in labor racketeering, its power was gradually eroding. The family's leaders had to constantly adapt to the increasing pressure from law enforcement and the growing presence of rival factions that sought to seize control of New York's lucrative criminal enterprises. The other families, including the Colombo, Lucchese, and Bonanno families, faced similar struggles. These families, once solidified as part of the ruling five, were now more fractured than ever. As the younger generation of mafia bosses sought to assert their control, they began to distance themselves from the traditional practices that had once defined the mafia. They were less concerned with preserving the traditions of the past and more focused on the profitability of their operations. This shift in priorities caused tensions within the families, as older members struggled to maintain their influence, while the younger generation pushed for greater autonomy and control. The fragmentation of the five families was also compounded by the rise of new criminal organizations. While the mafia had once been the dominant force in organized crime, new groups, such as the Russian and Colombian cartels, began to encroach on their territory. These emerging organizations, often more ruthless and technologically advanced, presented a new kind of competition for the mafia. The families, already stretched thin from infighting and the pressure from law enforcement, now had to contend with these rising threats. The once tight-knit control that the mafia had over New York's underworld was now being challenged on multiple fronts. In response to these challenges, the mafia's strategies evolved. Where the old dons had relied on muscle and brute force to maintain control, the new wave of mafia leaders began to focus more on corporate-style operations. They laundered money through legitimate businesses, infiltrated stock markets, and expanded into new, more discreet criminal activities like cybercrime. The mafia, once a brute force of violence and intimidation, was attempting to modernize and adapt to a new era of crime. Yet, even as they expanded into new territories and tried to innovate, the mafia was never able to return to its former glory. The damage had been done, the families had been fractured, their networks infiltrated, and their old ways of doing business had been exposed to the world. The dawn of the 21st century saw the mafia's influence in New York reduced to a shadow of its former self. Law enforcement, bolstered by new technologies, continued to dismantle the mafia piece by piece. The old-school dons were either imprisoned or dead, and the families had become fractured, less cohesive, and more vulnerable to external threats. Despite the mafia's efforts to reinvent itself, it was clear that the world was changing in ways they could not control. The era of the five families, once a period of unrivaled power and dominance, had come to an end. The mafia had been brought to its knees by a combination of law enforcement pressure, internal strife, and the changing dynamics of the criminal world. The once mighty empire, built on a foundation of loyalty, violence, and secrecy, had crumbled. The five families were no longer the undisputed rulers of New York's underworld, they were now a relic of the past, their empire broken, their future uncertain. By the dawn of the 21st century, the underworld of New York had irrevocably shifted. The five families, once the epitome of power, influence, and fear, were now navigating the consequences of their own success. The cracks in their empire, which had been forming for decades, had widened into deep fissures, and the inevitable decay was becoming harder to ignore. The mafia, once a cohesive force that ruled the city with a seemingly unbreakable grip, now found itself struggling to maintain relevance in a rapidly changing world. The same violence, secrecy, and tradition that had sustained the families for so long now seemed antiquated in the face of modern law enforcement, new forms of criminality, and shifting societal norms. The last vestiges of the mafia's power were visible in the fragmented, broken state of the five families. The members who had once been loyal foot soldiers, trusted capos, and powerful underbosses, had either been incarcerated or turned informants. Many of the seasoned leaders had been brought down by the sheer weight of their criminal activities. The very tactics that had once kept them safe were now being used against them. Wiretaps, surveillance, and the increasing presence of undercover agents had made the mafia more vulnerable than it had ever been before. The turning point came with the conviction of John Gotti, the infamous Teflon Don, who had once epitomized the unshakable power of the Gambino family. Gotti's ability to avoid conviction for years, despite overwhelming evidence against him, made him a symbol of the mafia's unassailable strength. His brash personality, combined with his penchant for making headlines, made him a public figure in his own right. But in the end, it was his overexposure that led to his downfall. Gotti's relentless pursuit of the spotlight was his undoing. His underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, turned against him, agreeing to testify for the government in exchange for a lighter sentence. Gravano's testimony, along with the mountain of evidence gathered against Gotti, led to his conviction on charges of murder, racketeering, and other crimes. Gotti's fall from power was a devastating blow to the Gambino family, but it also symbolized the larger unraveling of the mafia's empire. Gotti's conviction marked the beginning of the end for the old guard of mafia leadership. With the demise of the Gambino family's most powerful boss, the mafia in New York was left scrambling for control. The vacuum left by Gotti's absence caused infighting and betrayal, as other members of the Gambino family vied for power. The organization, once united under a single, powerful figure, fractured into competing factions. But Gotti's conviction didn't just weaken the Gambino family, it reverberated throughout the entire mafia structure. The conviction of such a prominent figure was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, was immune from the law. The days of unchecked rule were over. As the years wore on, the other families, although still operational, were no longer the dominant forces they had once been. Law enforcement's increasing efforts to dismantle organized crime took a toll on the families, and their ability to operate with impunity diminished. The mafia's infiltration into legitimate businesses, their control of labor unions, and their vast networks of illicit activities were all under constant scrutiny. The very infrastructure that had made them so successful was now being systematically torn apart. The FBI, the NYPD, and other agencies coordinated efforts to track, infiltrate, and bring down the mafia. Task forces were formed, wiretaps were set up, and informants became increasingly common. The mafia's ability to operate behind the scenes had been one of its greatest strengths, but that strength was rapidly being eroded. With the rise of the internet, the digital age, and a new wave of law enforcement technologies, the mafia found itself ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of modern crime. The old methods of bribing officials, using violence to intimidate rivals, and relying on coded language in secret meetings were becoming obsolete. The new wave of criminal organizations, ranging from international cartels to cybercrime syndicates, were adapting to these technological changes much more quickly. The mafia's traditional stronghold of New York was being challenged by these emerging forces, and the families, once so feared, now found themselves scrambling to adapt. While they had dominated the world of organized crime for decades, they were now beginning to lose their grip on their own territory. Meanwhile, the younger generation of mafia members, those who had grown up in the shadow of the five families but had not experienced the heyday of their power, were facing a different set of challenges. For them, the old ways of doing business seemed outdated, and the new world of organized crime was shifting beneath their feet. These younger members of the families were often more ambitious and less inclined to adhere to the strict traditions and codes that had governed the mafia for generations. They were looking for new ways to make money and gain power, and in many cases, they turned to modern-day criminal enterprises that were more flexible and far less dependent on the old-school violence that had defined the mafia's previous reign. The fragmentation of the families was also reflected in their relationships with each other. For years, the five families had operated under a kind of uneasy truce, bound together by mutual self-interest and a shared understanding of the value of peace. The Commission, the governing body that oversaw the activities of the families, had been an important mechanism for maintaining stability within the organization. However, with the rise of younger and more independent-minded leaders, the Commission's influence began to wane. Instead of acting as a cohesive unit, the families began to splinter, with each family becoming more concerned with its own survival than with maintaining the peace among them. Rivalries between the families, once muted in the interest of mutual cooperation, began to heat up. This new era of competition within the mafia meant that the once unified force was now a fragmented entity. The story of the five families was also one of declining loyalty. Once the mafia had been a tight-knit organization, built on trust and the unflinching loyalty of its members. The phrase, blood in, blood out, encapsulated the mafia's ethos of loyalty to the family above all else. However, as the organization weakened and external pressure increased, the code of silence, omerta, began to break down. Informants became more common, and the culture of silence that had once defined the mafia was being replaced by self-preservation. The rise of informants, like Salvatore Gravano, who had testified against Gotti, made it clear that the mafia's ability to maintain its code of silence was no longer as ironclad as it once had been. The increasing presence of rats within the mafia further destabilized the families. With each betrayal, the power of the families waned, and their ability to maintain control over their territories became increasingly difficult. Another major blow came in the form of the changing landscape of law enforcement. The FBI, bolstered by a string of successful convictions and improved intelligence-gathering techniques, began to relentlessly pursue the mafia on a national scale. The RICO Act had been passed in 1970, and its ramifications continued to be felt throughout the 1990s and beyond. The act allowed for the prosecution of individuals involved in a criminal enterprise, regardless of whether they had directly committed the crimes. This tool was particularly effective in dismantling mafia organizations, as it allowed prosecutors to target not just the foot soldiers but the high-ranking bosses as well. With each new indictment, another layer of the mafia's leadership was stripped away. The once seemingly invincible mafia bosses were now facing long prison sentences, and the families were losing their hold over their territories. In the midst of all this turmoil, the city of New York itself was changing. The neighborhoods that had once been under mafia control were undergoing gentrification. The once dominant industries in which the mafia had invested, such as construction and labor unions, were now increasingly subject to government oversight and reform. The traditional ways of making money for the families, through extortion, loan sharking, and racketeering, were now being replaced by more modern criminal activities like drug trafficking and white-collar crime. But even these ventures were increasingly under pressure from law enforcement and rival criminal organizations. The rise of the internet and globalization opened new avenues for crime but also brought new challenges for the mafia, which had once thrived in its localized, shadowy operations. As the 2000s progressed, the influence of the five families began to fade further. Law enforcement continued its relentless pursuit, new generations of criminals with different business models began to dominate the streets, and the mafia's once pristine reputation for power and loyalty had been replaced by an image of corruption, disarray, and disillusionment. The power vacuum created by the disintegration of the five families left New York's criminal landscape vastly different than it had been in the mid-20th century. By the time the mafia entered the 21st century, the families that had once been the kings of New York's underworld had become mere shadows of their former selves. Though they continued to exist in some form, their power was no longer what it once was. The combination of law enforcement success, the rise of new criminal enterprises, and internal fragmentation had dealt a death blow to the once mighty five families. The mafia's dominance over New York, which had lasted for decades, had faded into history, leaving only echoes of its violent, turbulent past. The year 2000 marked the beginning of a new millennium, and with it, the mafia in New York found itself in a precarious position. The days of untouchable power were over. The once invincible five families, once the very fabric of organized crime in the city, were now facing the unrelenting force of modern law enforcement, technological advancements, and a changing criminal landscape. Where they once thrived in the shadows, operating behind a veil of secrecy and terror, the mafia was now exposed, vulnerable, and struggling to maintain its grip on the city's underworld. What had been a well-oiled machine of violence, extortion, and corruption was now being picked apart, piece by piece, by both external forces and internal dysfunction. The tactics that had once made the mafia so successful were no longer effective. The government's war on organized crime had intensified in the late 20th century, and by the time the 21st century rolled around, the mafia's power had been severely diminished. The FBI, NYPD, and other law enforcement agencies were more coordinated than ever before, with greater resources, improved surveillance techniques, and an increasing number of agents dedicated to bringing down the mafia. The mafia's operations, once cloaked in secrecy, were now under constant scrutiny. Wiretaps, surveillance cameras, undercover operations, and informants were tools that law enforcement used with devastating effectiveness. The very methods that the mafia had used to keep the authorities at bay were now being turned against them. John Gotti's conviction in the 1990s had been a blow to the Gambino family, but it was also a symbol of the crumbling empire. Gotti's conviction, after years of legal battles and his ability to evade prosecution, had marked the end of an era for the mafia. For decades, he had been the embodiment of mafia power in New York, a figure whose brazen defiance of the law had earned him both admiration and fear. But his conviction signaled a shift. It showed that even the most powerful, high-profile figures within the mafia were vulnerable to the modern tools of law enforcement. Gotti had once been known as the Teflon Don, because no charges seemed to stick to him. But in the end, it was his overconfidence, his penchant for the spotlight, and his failure to adapt to the changing environment that led to his downfall. His conviction, along with the increasing number of other mafia bosses who were being arrested, convicted, and imprisoned, marked the beginning of the end for the once formidable power of the five families. While the Gambino family was reeling from the loss of its charismatic leader, the other families were also facing their own challenges. The Genovese family, once considered the most powerful of the five families, was dealing with internal struggles of its own. Leadership transitions were never easy within the mafia, and the Genovese family had its fair share of infighting. However, it was not just internal strife that was threatening the Genovese family's power. The FBI, always one step ahead, had infiltrated many of their operations, exposing the family's most lucrative criminal enterprises. Their once commanding presence in the world of labor racketeering, which had been a major source of income for the family, was being eroded as labor unions began to reform and grow more resistant to mafia control. The Genovese family, like the others, was losing ground, and their former dominance was quickly slipping away. The Colombo family, too, was struggling. While it had long been one of the most volatile families, plagued by leadership disputes and violent internal battles, its power was waning. The rise of younger, more ambitious leaders, who were eager to make their mark in a rapidly changing world, only intensified the internal divisions. The Bonanno family, likewise, was struggling to maintain control after the downfall of their once prominent boss, Joseph Massino. The Bonannos, which had once been one of the most influential families in the city, found themselves dealing with betrayal from within. Massino, who had once been a powerful figure in the mafia world, became an informant, flipping to the government and exposing his own family's operations. His testimony was a significant blow to the Bonanno family, and it shattered the trust that had been central to the mafia's operations for decades. But the problems for the five families weren't just internal. External forces were wreaking havoc on their operations. The emergence of new, more ruthless criminal organizations was one of the most significant threats the mafia faced in the 21st century. The Russian and Colombian cartels, with their international reach, brought new levels of violence and sophistication to the drug trade. The rise of the internet and digital crime opened up new avenues for criminal enterprises to operate, and these new organizations were far more nimble, technologically advanced, and willing to adapt to the changing times. The mafia, which had once been able to control the illicit drug trade and other major criminal enterprises, was now facing competition from more modern, efficient criminal organizations. The five families, entrenched in their old ways of doing business, could not keep up with these new players. The most significant shift, however, was the increasing involvement of law enforcement in the fight against organized crime. The FBI, which had always been a thorn in the side of the mafia, had become more sophisticated in its tactics. The agency had infiltrated the families with undercover agents, used wiretaps to gather evidence, and utilized informants who had once been loyal members of the mafia. The FBI was relentless, and its efforts were proving to be effective. In addition to the FBI's efforts, local law enforcement and the NYPD had become more focused on cracking down on organized crime, aided by new technology and improved intelligence sharing practices. The passing of the RICO Act in the 1970s had paved the way for the government's more aggressive tactics. By the time the 21st century arrived, the RICO Act had been used to target not only low-level mobsters but also the leaders of the families. The act allowed prosecutors to charge mafia members as part of a larger conspiracy, meaning that even the most powerful mafia bosses could be held accountable for the actions of their underlings. This legal weapon proved to be invaluable in dismantling the five families. Once, the mafia could rely on its ability to operate under the radar, to bribe officials, to use force when necessary. But now, every action they took could be scrutinized, recorded, and used against them. With every passing year, the grip of the five families on New York grew weaker. The public perception of the mafia had changed dramatically. What had once been seen as an elite, untouchable organization was now viewed with disdain, as its leaders were exposed for the corrupt, self-interested individuals they were. The families had gone from being the silent rulers of the city's criminal landscape to the subjects of constant investigations, raids, and prosecutions. Their legacy of violence, secrecy, and power was being slowly eroded by the force of law and the reality of a changing world. However, despite the setbacks, the mafia in New York was far from being completely eradicated. The families still operated, though on a much smaller scale. Their criminal enterprises had been severely reduced, but remnants of their power lingered in the shadows. The rise of new criminal enterprises had shifted the landscape, but the mafia was still there, operating in the background, adapting where it could. The old world of organized crime had fractured, but its influence remained, albeit in a diluted form. The five families, though no longer the dominant force they once were, continued to exist in a much reduced form in the early 21st century. The mafia's days of running New York, of commanding fear and loyalty, were over. But they had not vanished completely. Instead, they had become a shell of their former selves, a shadow of the great criminal empire they had once been. Their influence had waned, but the story of their rise and fall had become a lasting part of New York's history, an enduring legacy of power, betrayal, and the inevitable consequences of a criminal life. As the 21st century progressed, the mafia's once thriving empire in New York seemed all but lost, but their story was far from over. The five families, though vastly diminished, still retained some influence, albeit in a much smaller, less visible form. What had once been a well-coordinated network of crime families, working in perfect synchrony to control vast swaths of the city's underworld, was now a shadow of its former self. However, these remnants of power were not ready to disappear quietly. The families, broken and splintered by decades of law enforcement pressure, internal betrayal, and changing criminal landscapes, still managed to hold on, often operating in ways that reflected the dire need for survival in a world that no longer had room for their old-school tactics. By the early 2000s, the mafia in New York had taken on a more clandestine and adaptive nature. The public perception of organized crime was no longer that of a feared and respected institution. Instead, it had become a symbol of decay and desperation. Law enforcement, having dismantled large parts of the mafia's infrastructure, now found itself dealing with a criminal enterprise that was no longer as organized or cohesive as it once had been. The glory days of the five families, their iconic influence over businesses, unions, and the criminal underworld, had faded. The fear and loyalty that once sustained them had all but evaporated. But the power of the families wasn't extinguished entirely. Instead, it had been transformed into a more insidious form of operation, fragmented but persistent. The years following the conviction of John Gotti and the subsequent disarray of the Gambino family were a time of flux for the five families. As the decades passed, each family faced internal strife, shifting allegiances, and the continued onslaught of legal challenges. The Gambinos, now led by different figures after Gotti's imprisonment, were struggling to maintain the same level of control that had once been synonymous with the family name. The leadership vacuum created by Gotti's fall had made it easy for rival factions within the family to fight for dominance. Internal discord, paired with the relentless efforts of law enforcement, meant the once mighty Gambino family was now struggling to keep its feet under it. The other families, Genovese, Colombo, Lucchese, and Bonanno, were also suffering from a similar malaise. The old guard had been decimated by arrests, witness testimonies, and a failure to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. While these families were still operational, their activities had become more scattered and less efficient. The golden age of the mafia, where each family had its territories and lucrative rackets, was now behind them. Their involvement in major criminal enterprises, such as drug trafficking, loan sharking, and extortion, had been under constant attack by both law enforcement and modern-day criminals who had adapted to the newer, more discreet ways of operating. At the same time, new challenges emerged for the mafia. The criminal world was evolving in unexpected ways. While the old ways of mob violence and intimidation were still used, they were being supplemented, or even replaced, by a new breed of crime. International drug cartels, sophisticated cybercrime networks, and white-collar criminals were on the rise, and they operated on a scale and with a reach that the mafia simply couldn't match. The old tricks, bribery, muscle, and intimidation, didn't work as effectively in this new world. The rise of global crime syndicates left the mafia at a disadvantage, unable to keep pace with organizations that had access to new technologies and the ability to spread their influence across borders with ease. The families, especially those in New York, were increasingly sidelined in favor of newer, more adaptable criminal entities. These international cartels were not bound by territorial limitations or by the rigid traditions that the mafia adhered to, making them more difficult to combat and far more lucrative in their dealings. While the families were no longer the juggernaut of organized crime they once were, the holdovers from the old days were still trying to adapt to this new reality. The mafia had always been a family business, and the idea of loyalty to the organization was one that had been passed down from generation to generation. But with the families now fractured, leadership and loyalty were no longer as easily enforced. Younger members, many of whom had never known the full power of the mafia, grew increasingly disillusioned with the old ways of doing business. These members were more interested in quickly making money and less concerned with the mafia's historical codes of silence and loyalty. They often operated with less caution and more ambition, which brought them into direct conflict with their older counterparts, who still held on to the traditional ways of the mafia. Despite these growing tensions within the families, the mafia still had one powerful weapon in its arsenal, its ability to manipulate and infiltrate. While the vast criminal enterprises that the families once controlled were shrinking, the mafia still had its roots deeply embedded in New York's infrastructure. The families had long exerted influence over labor unions, construction sites, and the waterfront, and they maintained connections to powerful figures in politics and law enforcement. These old connections still proved valuable, even if they were no longer as widespread or as dominant as they had been in the past. The remnants of the mafia's power could still be seen in these subtle manipulations of local businesses, even though they no longer commanded the vast resources they once had. But for every victory the mafia achieved, there was a corresponding defeat. Law enforcement had become more relentless, and as the years passed, it became harder for the families to escape the long arm of the law. With each arrest, indictment, and conviction, the families lost more of their influence and reach. The continued prosecution of high-ranking mobsters, the breaking of omerta by informants, and the erosion of traditional mafia businesses all contributed to a steady decline in the mafia's power. Even the Gambino family, once one of the most powerful criminal syndicates in the country, found itself splintered, with members either incarcerated or in hiding, struggling to maintain a foothold in an increasingly hostile environment. The government's use of the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, RICO, Act had been devastating to the mafia, allowing prosecutors to target not just individual criminals, but entire criminal enterprises. RICO was a game-changer for law enforcement, and it allowed them to bring down entire mafia families. The act had led to the prosecution and conviction of hundreds of mafia members, from low-level soldiers to high-ranking dons. The overwhelming power of RICO, combined with the rise of new surveillance techniques, such as wiretaps and undercover agents, made it harder than ever for the families to operate undetected. Their once secretive world was being exposed, and every meeting, every phone call, and every interaction was a potential trap. The ease with which law enforcement could now gather evidence meant that the mafia's days of secrecy and impunity were numbered. While the families tried to adapt, they were also facing the growing problem of a lack of cohesion. The traditional mafia code of silence, which had once bound the families together in a shared sense of loyalty, was being eroded. As law enforcement grew more effective at infiltrating the ranks of the families, more and more individuals were turning state's evidence. The era of silence, or omerta, was becoming a distant memory as members of the families turned on each other to save themselves. Informants were no longer the rare exceptions, they were becoming the rule. As the number of informants grew, the mafia's ability to trust its own members dwindled. The streets of New York, once ruled by fear and respect for the mafia, had grown quieter over the years. The familiar buzz of mafia activity, extortion, loan sharking, rackets, was now a shadow of what it had been in the past. The families were no longer the power brokers they had once been. Their control over New York's criminal empire had been shattered, replaced by a more fragmented and competitive world. No longer the undisputed rulers of the underworld, the five families had been reduced to a group of fractured entities clinging to the remnants of their former glory. Yet, in their weakened state, the families were not completely powerless. They still controlled pockets of territory, small but lucrative operations that had managed to survive the relentless assault from law enforcement. But these operations, though profitable, were no longer the empire they had once ruled. The world of organized crime had changed, and the mafia, unable to adapt fully to the new criminal landscape, had become a shadow of what it once was. The crime families were still part of the story of New York's underworld, but their era of dominance had ended. The five families had once represented the pinnacle of organized crime in the United States, with vast empires built on secrecy, loyalty, and violence. But by the 21st century, their power had been broken, their grip on the city loosened, and their methods exposed. Their history, filled with triumphs, betrayals, and bloodshed, had become a cautionary tale for future generations. The legacy of the mafia was no longer one of unchecked power, but of inevitable decline, a reminder that even the most powerful empires must eventually fall. And as the years continued to pass, the once mighty families faded further into the shadows of history, their influence fading, their stories becoming legends. By the mid-2000s, the mafia had become a mere shadow of its former self. The five families, once the undisputed rulers of New York's underworld, were now struggling to maintain their hold over the city they had once controlled with an iron fist. The rise of globalization, the advent of digital crime, and the tireless efforts of law enforcement had decimated the mafia's once vast empire. Yet, despite the fragmentation of the families and the growing pressure from the authorities, there was still a lingering presence, though no longer the powerful, fearsome force that had once dictated the fate of many. The legacy of the mafia was now one of survival, adaptation, and a desperate clinging to what remained of their power. The continuing decline of the five families was a multifaceted process. The criminal activities that had once fueled their empire, extortion, loan sharking, racketeering, and control over the unions, had become increasingly difficult to sustain. The mafia's traditional methods of power had lost their effectiveness in the face of modern law enforcement tactics and a more advanced, tech-driven world. However, the family businesses, once considered untouchable, still managed to find ways to adapt to the new reality. The streets of New York, once filled with mafia enforcers and rackets, were no longer dominated by the loud, brash intimidation tactics of yesteryear. Instead, a more subtle, less obvious form of control emerged. One of the significant shifts that the mafia had to navigate was the increasing presence of the internet and the rise of cybercrime. The world of digital crime, hacking, identity theft, cyber extortion, was something the mafia had been slow to embrace. But as technology advanced, it became increasingly difficult to ignore. The younger generation of mafia members, who had grown up in an era of rapid technological change, were more inclined to engage in digital crime. The ability to carry out illicit activities from behind a screen, far removed from the prying eyes of law enforcement, made cybercrime an appealing prospect. But the families struggled to fully integrate this new form of criminal enterprise into their established culture. They were still bound by traditions that had worked for generations, making it hard to adapt quickly enough. The digital world also meant that the mafia's ability to control territory in the same way was less effective. The internet allowed criminal organizations to transcend geographical boundaries, allowing them to establish international networks. The mafia, once territorial in its dominance of neighborhoods and districts, now found itself competing with other criminal enterprises on a global scale. Colombian drug cartels, Russian crime syndicates, and Eastern European gangs were quickly emerging as the new power players in the global criminal landscape. The mafia, with its old-world methods, couldn't keep up. Its reliance on street-level enforcement, intimidation, and the occasional act of violence now seemed out of place in a world where cybercriminals could steal millions from the comfort of their homes. The rise of international cartels was a particularly devastating blow. While the mafia had once controlled much of the drug trade, these new, more sophisticated organizations were able to smuggle drugs across borders at an unprecedented scale. They operated with greater speed, using modern technology and logistics to outpace the old-world methods that the mafia had relied on. The cartels were more organized, less susceptible to law enforcement infiltration, and more willing to engage in brutal violence. The mafia, which had built its empire on the illegal drug trade, found itself unable to compete with these larger, more ruthless organizations. At the same time, the war on terror in the post-9/11 world had brought about increased security measures, government surveillance, and a more aggressive approach to organized crime. The FBI, which had always been at odds with the mafia, now had an expanded mandate to pursue criminal organizations, and they were doing so with unprecedented zeal. The tools available to law enforcement were evolving as well. New technologies, such as wiretaps, GPS tracking, and forensic data analysis, made it easier than ever for the authorities to track, infiltrate, and dismantle criminal organizations. The mafia's reliance on face-to-face meetings and codes of silence was no longer enough to keep them hidden from prying eyes. And yet, despite all the setbacks, the mafia had a resilience that defied expectations. Even as the once mighty five families fractured, splintered by infighting, betrayal, and the long arm of the law, they still managed to hold on to some of their former power. The families had learned to operate more discreetly, often using low-level street criminals to do their bidding while the higher-ups stayed out of the spotlight. The mafia's operations, though reduced in scope, still functioned in the shadows. They had lost their grip on many of the rackets that had once funded their operations, but they still had a hand in various criminal enterprises, including the drug trade, gambling, and even the still lucrative business of loan sharking. Their involvement in legitimate businesses had also been scaled back, but it remained a part of their portfolio. They still had connections to labor unions, construction companies, and even some local politicians, though these relationships were far more strained than they had been in the past. One of the key elements that kept the mafia alive, even in a diminished form, was its ability to blend in. While the families no longer had the same level of control over New York streets, their influence could still be felt in subtle ways. The mafia had long been adept at operating under the radar, staying just below the surface of mainstream society. In many ways, they had become like parasites, feeding off the vulnerabilities of the city's legitimate industries and political systems. It was no longer about openly running the city's criminal underworld, but about maintaining a quiet, steady influence on the fringes. Their networks of informants, operatives, and made men ensured that they could still get the job done, even if it was no longer as glamorous or as overt as it once was. In the midst of this decline, the mafia's leadership structure had also undergone significant changes. The role of the Don had become less relevant, as power within the families shifted toward smaller, more nimble factions. The traditional hierarchy, capos, underbosses, and consigliera, was still in place, but it no longer held the same weight. The families, though they maintained a semblance of organization, had been fractured by arrests, defections, and the simple erosion of their old power bases. The more established families, such as the Gambinos and Genovese, were still operational, but the sense of unity and purpose that had once defined them was gone. The mafia had become a patchwork quilt of factions, each trying to survive in a world that was no longer hospitable to their brand of criminality. The culture of loyalty and silence, which had once been the backbone of the mafia's success, was also beginning to erode. The old code of omerta, an unwavering vow of silence in the face of law enforcement, was being increasingly broken. Informants had become a commonplace feature of mafia life, and betrayal had become an accepted part of the business. The very code that had once held the families together was now being used against them. The increasing number of cooperating witnesses, or rats, had created a climate of distrust within the families. Members who once would have died for the organization were now willing to turn on each other for a reduced sentence or a promise of protection. The once unshakable loyalty that had defined the mafia was being replaced by a culture of survivalism. The fear of being arrested, convicted, or killed was a constant companion for mafia members, and many began to prioritize self-preservation over allegiance to the family. In a world where loyalty no longer carried the same weight it once did, the mafia found itself at odds with the very principles that had made it so powerful in the first place. Without that loyalty, the families had lost their sense of unity, and their strength had been eroded. By the time the 2010s arrived, the five families had become a fractured, disorganized mess, with little power to show for their former might. The streets that had once belonged to them were now controlled by a combination of new criminal organizations, technological advances, and law enforcement agencies. The mafia's influence over the city had faded, and they had been replaced by a new wave of criminals who operated in ways that the mafia had never imagined. The once great empire had collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction, and the families had been left to survive in a world where their methods were outdated and ineffective. Yet, even as their power dwindled and their operations were reduced to shadows, the story of the mafia in New York remained an indelible part of the city's history. Their rise to power had been meteoric, their grip on the city unshakable for decades. But in the end, their fall had been inevitable. The world had changed, and the mafia, despite its resilience and adaptability, could not keep up with the times. Their legacy, filled with stories of power, betrayal, violence, and corruption, would live on. But the five families, as they had once been, were no more. As the years continued to slip by, the mafia's hold on New York's underworld became more tenuous, a slow unraveling that seemed inevitable as each year passed. What had once been the defining force in organized crime in the United States, an intricate web of power, corruption, and brutality, was now a mere echo of its former self. The five families, despite their best efforts to adapt, had found themselves outpaced by a world that was changing faster than they could manage. Yet, even as their reign over the city dwindled, their story wasn't over. They still held on to remnants of power, small fragments of their old empire that, while increasingly insignificant in the grand scheme of things, provided a glimpse into what had once been. The mafia's decline in the early 21st century wasn't just a result of law enforcement pressure or new forms of criminal competition. It was also tied to the very culture that had sustained it for so long. The mafia's values, loyalty, silence, respect, and honor, had long been the pillars upon which the organization had built its power. These values had kept the families united, binding them in a tight-knit network of trust and mutual respect. But as the world evolved, so too did the individuals within the families. The younger generation, less connected to the old-world codes of conduct, increasingly saw the mafia not as a brotherhood, but as a business, one that was rife with opportunity, but also fraught with danger. This shift in attitude had deep implications for the mafia's structure. No longer was there the same unwavering loyalty to the organization or to the men who led it. As the families struggled to maintain their control, their internal dynamics became more volatile. Members who had once adhered to the code of silence began to see it as a hindrance, especially when they were faced with the prospect of long prison sentences. The age-old vow of omerta, the mafia's famous code of silence, began to crack as more and more members turned state's evidence to save themselves. The loyalty that had kept the families strong had been replaced by a survivalist mentality, one that prioritized self-preservation over the well-being of the family. By the time the mafia's leaders were being rounded up in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was clear that the organization had lost much of its former power. Law enforcement had become more adept at infiltrating the families, with informants inside the ranks and surveillance operations that had the ability to track every movement and communication. The FBI had refined its methods, and the relentless pursuit of criminal figures was a driving force in the dismantling of the mafia's operations. The families, no longer able to operate in the same way they had for decades, had found themselves constantly battling against the mounting pressure from both law enforcement and their internal divisions. The once proud mafia was now a fractured network, struggling to maintain its grip on the streets of New York. The Gambino family, once the most powerful of the five families, was particularly hard hit. The imprisonment of John Gotti, who had been the face of the family for so long, left a gaping hole in the leadership structure. Gotti had been known as the Teflon Don, able to avoid conviction despite numerous attempts to bring him down. However, in the end, his arrogance and the spotlight he craved had led to his downfall. His conviction in 1992 marked the beginning of a downward spiral for the Gambino family, and by the early 2000s, it had become a shell of its former self. The family, weakened by the loss of its charismatic leader, was struggling to maintain control over its territory. Its influence in the city was diminished, and its once profitable enterprises were being eroded by both law enforcement and newer, more adaptable criminal organizations. Meanwhile, the other families were facing similar struggles. The Genovese family, once the most powerful of the five families, was dealing with its own internal strife. The leadership had been unstable for years, with numerous bosses being arrested, imprisoned, or killed. The Genovese family had always been known for its ability to maintain a low profile, operating quietly and efficiently. But even their ability to operate under the radar had been compromised by the increasing reach of law enforcement and the rise of new, more sophisticated criminal organizations. Their once dominant position in the world of labor racketeering had been diminished, as unions became more resistant to the mafia's control. The Genovese family, like the others, had seen its power wane in the face of modern challenges. The Colombo family, too, had been rocked by internal conflict. Once one of the most volatile of the five families, the Colombo family was marked by infighting and leadership struggles. In the 1990s, the family's boss, Big John Palermo, was gunned down, and his successors faced a series of challenges. The family's power had always been tenuous, and the constant internal strife only made matters worse. The Colombo family, with its fractured leadership and lack of cohesion, found itself struggling to maintain any semblance of order. While it had once been one of the more powerful families in the city, by the 2000s, it was a shell of its former self, constantly battling for survival in a world that had passed it by. The Lucchese family, meanwhile, had managed to retain some level of stability, but it too was facing mounting challenges. The family's operations, once based in garment manufacturing and racketeering, had been increasingly targeted by law enforcement. As the FBI and NYPD began to clamp down on these traditional mafia operations, the Lucchese family found itself struggling to adapt. While it still maintained some control over the city's criminal underworld, the family's once immense power was fading. The family's hold over its traditional rackets was weakening, and its ability to expand into new, more profitable ventures was severely limited by law enforcement scrutiny. The Bonanno family, one of the most storied of the five families, was also reeling from internal division and betrayal. In the 2000s, Joseph Massino, the family's boss, turned informant and began cooperating with the authorities, providing them with invaluable information about the family's operations. Massino's betrayal sent shockwaves through the Bonanno family, and the fallout was immediate and devastating. The family's leadership was thrown into chaos, and its once prominent position in the mafia world was permanently tarnished. The Bonanno family's reputation, already marred by a history of violence and betrayal, was further damaged by the revelations that came to light as a result of Massino's cooperation with the government. As the years went on, the five families found themselves increasingly irrelevant in the world of organized crime. The rise of global criminal networks, fueled by the increasing interconnectedness of the world, had shifted the balance of power away from the mafia. The cartels and syndicates of Colombia, Russia, and Eastern Europe now held sway over much of the illicit drug trade, and the mafia's once dominant role in smuggling, extortion, and racketeering was being eclipsed. The traditional mafia businesses, construction, labor racketeering, and gambling, were being overtaken by new, more modern forms of crime. Cybercrime, identity theft, and financial fraud were emerging as the new frontiers of criminal enterprise, and the mafia, unable to adapt quickly enough, was slowly being pushed out of the picture. The families, once so united in their ambition for power, were now fighting for scraps. The leadership, fractured and divided, had lost their former cohesion. The traditional mafia structure, based on loyalty and family, was now a relic of a bygone era. In its place was a fragmented, often desperate organization, trying to hold on to whatever it could in a world that had no room for its antiquated methods. The strong, silent code that had once bound the mafia together had become a weakness. The desire for personal gain had overtaken the sense of loyalty to the family, and the relentless drive for survival meant that many members were willing to betray each other at the first sign of trouble. By the end of the 2000s, the five families were no longer the dominant force in New York's criminal underworld. Their influence had been diminished, and their operations were scattered and less cohesive. The mafia's power, once so absolute, had crumbled under the weight of law enforcement pressure, modern criminal organizations, and its own internal decay. The families had survived, but they were no longer the titans of organized crime they once had been. Their empire, built on fear, violence, and loyalty, had eroded, leaving behind a fragmented and diminished version of the mighty organization that had once ruled the streets of New York. The story of the mafia was no longer one of conquest and power, but one of survival in a world that no longer had a place for them. As the 2010s arrived, the world had changed irrevocably, and with it, the mafia's role in New York's underworld. What had once been an empire, built on blood, betrayal, and boundless ambition, was now nothing more than a fading memory of a time when fear and loyalty governed the streets. The five families, though still in existence, had seen their power crumble, their grip on the city loosening with every passing year. The old guard, those men who had once ruled the criminal world with ruthless efficiency, had either been imprisoned, killed, or faded into obscurity. Those left behind, often younger, less experienced members, were faced with a landscape that was utterly foreign to the world their predecessors had known. This new world of crime was digital, international, and far more complex than the old-school mafia had ever anticipated. The generational shift within the mafia was particularly striking. The younger generation, unlike the men who had built the mafia's empire, were not raised with the same reverence for the family code of silence and loyalty. For them, the mafia was no longer a way of life, it was a business. They were more inclined to make quick money, take greater risks, and often sought to avoid the bloodshed that had once been commonplace in mafia operations. These younger members often looked for new ways to make money, seeking more modern criminal avenues, like cybercrime or white-collar fraud, rather than relying on the traditional rackets of extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling. But even as the mafia struggled to adapt to the changing world, it was clear that its legacy still held a certain power. Despite the decline, the five families continued to exert a degree of influence in the underworld. Though no longer as dominant as they once were, they still controlled certain sectors of the criminal economy. This was not a return to the glory days, but rather a slow, steady decline into a new era where the mafia's presence was more like a shadow, ever present but far less tangible. In fact, much of what remained of their empire was built not on violence or intimidation, but on the subtle, behind-the-scenes manipulation of the system, using their connections in legitimate businesses, labor unions, and political circles to maintain their place in the city's power structures. One of the greatest challenges the families faced was maintaining their operations in a world where technology had become both a tool and a weapon. The digital age had introduced an entirely new set of challenges that the mafia had never dealt with before. Cybercrime, a term that would have been foreign to the old dons of the mafia, had become the new frontier for organized crime. The internet, social media, and digital communications made it possible for criminals to operate on a global scale, with anonymity and speed that the mafia's old tactics could never match. While the families still tried to hold on to their traditional enterprises, such as the control of local businesses and labor unions, their ability to engage in the more lucrative operations, such as large-scale drug trafficking or arms dealing, had been significantly hindered by their failure to adapt to the technological revolution. The authorities, too, had become more adept at using technology against them. Surveillance tools, wiretaps, and tracking devices were just the beginning. The FBI and other law enforcement agencies now had access to sophisticated hacking techniques and cyber tools that allowed them to infiltrate criminal networks in ways the mafia never could have anticipated. What had once been an organization that prided itself on secrecy and keeping its operations in the shadows was now exposed, vulnerable, and constantly under threat. The government's use of the RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, Act, a legal weapon introduced in the 1970s, continued to be one of the most effective methods of bringing down the families, allowing law enforcement to prosecute entire organizations, not just individual members. The continued success of this tactic, along with the increasing use of informants from within the families, made it clear that the mafia's days of operating with impunity were numbered. Despite these challenges, the families persisted. Though their operations were no longer as grand or as visible as they once had been, they still held on to certain sectors of power. Much of this power came from their long-standing relationships within the political and business establishments. Over the decades, the mafia had cultivated a vast network of connections in every aspect of New York's economy, construction, waste management, transportation, and even entertainment. These relationships, which had once been forged through intimidation and corruption, were now being leveraged in quieter, more subtle ways. Politicians, business owners, and union leaders still feared crossing the mafia, even though its power was no longer as visible or as overt.